Molly is saying, in at least one video, I've heard Armin make the claim that there is no God. As someone who doesn't believe in God, I disagree with this. How do you know that a God doesn't exist? Maybe you misspoke and actually meant that you don't believe there is a God. Similarly, I've heard Richard Dawkins say that he thinks it's more probable that a God doesn't exist than that one does exist. Personally, I disagree with this as well because I see no way to determine probabilities here. What are your thoughts about this? Do you think that we should be advocating for the narrative of we don't know whether or not there's a God, so pretending that you do rather than there is no God?
No, I will say there's no God. Okay. I say there's no God because I don't go out of my way to say, well, we don't know if there's no Santa Claus. There could be a Santa Claus. There's no way to not prove there's no Santa Claus. I don't go and say like, okay, we don't know if werewolves are not real. We don't know if Peter Pan is not a real story. Like, we don't say these things. Like, yes, technically there is, like, you could come up with a scenario where there is Peter Pan, there is Santa Claus, there is werewolf, and you could come up with a way to come up with a scenario that those things are real and there's no way for you to disprove. Like, maybe there's a Peter Pan somewhere in this, in this bubble that nobody that is completely blind, the entire world is blind to, and there's no way for you to disprove that this Peter Pan world in this bubble doesn't exist. There's no way you could disprove that, right? I could come up with a scenario that there's no way for you to disprove that. But we don't, these things, we don't treat them as possible enough for us to treat like as if they're real. Like, when the possibility of something becomes so close to zero, we talk about them as if they are not real, right? It's only with God. Like, if you want to be philosophical and then, yeah, if you want to be accurate with your language and make sure that you're not saying something that is like, can philosophically make sense, say like, okay, I don't have any evidence for the existence of God, but there are some definitions of God that could be real and I can't disprove it, so I just lack a belief in God, but I'm not saying there's no God. And that's only for a deistic God, because for the other gods, the biblical gods, we can know that those gods are not don't exist because they're self-contradictory. But a deistic God, I can't prove it, therefore I lack belief in it, I'm not going to claim it doesn't exist. You could say that if you're being like, if you want to be like accurate and philosophical and all, but in the day-to-day life, we don't treat things that we have a possibility so close to zero. We don't treat them like that. We just say there is no werewolf, there is no Peter Pan, there is no Santa Claus, and there is no God. If you treat God differently, you're treating God different. Like, you're putting God on a pedestal compared to all those other things. And I think it's completely fair to assign possibility to these, like probability to these things. You say like, well, you just said, personally I disagree because I don't think there's any way to determine probabilities here. There absolutely is. And here's how you do it. How many things can I come up with? How many claims can I come up with that there's no way to disprove? There's infinite number of claims that I could come up with. As long as your imagination is good enough, there's infinite number of claims that I could come up with that there's no way for you to prove that it's true or that you could disprove that it's true. Given that there are infinite numbers of them, the possibility of each one of them is going to be 1 over infinity, because that's how many of them there are, right? So given that, what is 1 over infinity? 1 over infinity is not 0, but it's the closest thing to it. It's epsilon. It is basically almost 0, and that's how we're going to treat them, so close to 0 that we're going to just treat them practically. It makes sense for us to treat them as 0.
Okay. Yeah, I just have 2 things to say about this. First is it depends on what you mean by God, because if you're talking about God as like, Einstein or Spinoza's definition of God, then, it is genuinely, you probably assigning probabilities to it is a little bit more difficult. If you're talking about the theistic God who wrote all these books, about who you can sleep with and what you should eat and not eat and how much you should pay for your female slaves versus male slaves, if you have that kind of God, it's almost certainly non-existent. So I'm very comfortable with it. The second thing I want to say is that there's a difference between knowing and believing. Right? So I could say, do I know whether there's a God or not? No, I don't know. But do I believe in God? No, I don't believe in it. So there's a believing in something and saying whether you know or not whether something exists are 2 completely different things.
Hey guys, if you want to join these streams live, get your comments and questions read by Ali and Armin and the guests, and most importantly, to get full access to the full video versions of all these episodes, become a patron. link in the description below.